Next, the future of the two-party system. A panel of political scholars talks at the Institute of Policy Studies. This is about an hour.
Hello and welcome to Defining the Issues, a biweekly series sponsored by the Institute for Policy Studies. I'm Sarah Anderson of the Institute for Policy Studies, and we are the nation's oldest multi-issue progressive think tank. And today we're going to be talking about the Republican National Convention. As delegates are arriving in New York City, there's already been a lot of press coverage of this event, but I'd have to say I think most of it has focused on the not so substantive issues. One story we've been following closely here at IPS is the Battle of the Grass. You might know that this has to do with our allies, United for Peace and Justice, and their struggle for many months to try to get a permit for an anti-war demonstration in New York City's Central Park. Unfortunately, local officials there have decided it's more important to protect the grass than it is to protect freedom of speech. There's also been a lot of coverage of the security fortress that's being erected in New York City to protect the delegates. And then, of course, there's been the coverage of the dizzying array of celebrities that are converging in New York City to show their support for the grand old party. And you can imagine why it's a little hard to focus on the serious political matters when the likes of Wayne Newton or Bo Derek might pop up at any minute. Today, though, seriously, at IPS, we're going to focus on the serious stuff, the serious political, substantive issues. And we're going to go beyond the glitz and the glamour, the security hysteria to do this. We're going to look at what the Republican Party really stands for, or at least what they say they stand for in their official platform. We're going to look at compare and contrasting the Republican platform with the Democratic one. This is a follow-up to discussion we had earlier on the Democratic Party platform. And we'll also then look at this two-party system that we are living under. Is it really working for the American people? Is this the best democracy that we can have? And where is it going? Joining us today are two of the country's most astute political scholars. Here is Andy Levine, a professor of the University of Wisconsin and also an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland. He is the author of American Ideology, Engaging Political Philosophy, Hobbes to Rawls, as well as Rethinking Liberal Equality. We're also joined by my colleague, Marcus Raskin. He co-founded this organization, the Institute for Policy Studies, in 1963 after a stint with the Kennedy administration. More recently, he's the author of Liberalism, the Genius of American Ideals. And here at IPS, he also directs the Paths for the 21st Century project, which is producing a multi-volume work trying to learn the lessons from the past century. I also want to welcome our listeners on Pacifica Radio as well as our viewers on C-SPAN. I'm going to start out with a few questions for Mark Raskin because I think given his experience with the Kennedy administration and also as a very close observer of presidencies over the years, he can help us understand what is a political platform. What is the importance of it? Is there any importance to it? Is this something that is really a blueprint for political parties that they actually follow in detail? Or is it something that these delegates in New York and at previous conventions just toss in the garbage can as they're on their way out of the convention and no one ever pays any attention to it? So, Mark, if you could help us understand really the significance of these platforms.
Well, thank you for that. A place to begin, believe it or not, is in 1840 with Martin Van Buren, which apparently is the first party platform. And it ran 1,000 words, and it was committed to several positions. One position was that the federal government should be weak. Second, that you had to watch out for a national bank and be against it because the people who would end up running the country would be the rich, and you always had to guard against them. The third position was that states' rights, which meant that that abolitionists who were then on the move could be controlled locally by each of the states, that is, by the southern states especially. So that was the position they came from. Also, it was one of the first party conventions of a more major party, and it reflected Van Buren's view that you had to rationalize the party system, which until that time was which was a ragged system before then. In fact, in the Federalist Papers, the notion was that one of the great dangers was factions. And Madison made that argument about factions, and on the other hand, what you had to do was balance off the factions. And so this came to be rationalized then in the context of political parties. But just to pursue that for a moment, what happened is that parties then began looking for some coherence to their point of view, which was very, very hard to find because it was still comprised of various factions themselves. So that usually it's been the case that party platforms are compromises. The ones that usually are not compromises are small parties, that is, parties that are breakaway parties from the two major parties, or those who have a much stronger ideological cast. That isn't to say that the two major parties don't, and as we'll come to develop the argument, we'll see how, indeed, they have a very, very strong ideological cast, and I'm sure Andy will speak to that as well.
Mm-hmm. Can you think of examples, though, where information in the platform was not followed?
Well, I can think of one case. There are many cases, of course, but one case which is especially interesting to this generation and to the Vietnam generation. As you read the 1964 platform, when Lyndon Johnson ruled, I mean, he was a very, very strong candidate. He later got 62% of the vote against Barry Goldwater. The first several pages of that platform are given over to peace and how the most important thing that any nation and any national government can do is to assure the peace, is to develop those programs that assure peace. And one example that he gave for that purpose was the signing of the nuclear test ban arrangement, which was done under President Kennedy to show that this was a party of peace. Well, within 3 years, the fact was that 1967 came along, and he lost. He didn't lose the nomination there, but in New Hampshire, but he lost enough votes in. Against McCarthy there to drop out of the race. And part of the reason, in my view, that he dropped out of the race was a substantial number of the people in the Democratic Party were anti-war and had remembered the realities of that particular party platform. Now, you, of course, have other cases where...
Just to clarify, so they declared they were absolutely committed to peace, and that was shortly before getting into the Vietnam War.
Exactly. That was their purpose. They were committed to peace. Now, there were contradictions in that platform, and indeed you still see that in the Democratic platform. We're number one. We're going to stay number one. Nobody's going to push us around. We've increased our armaments and so forth and so on, so that you have both things going on at the same time. But the extraordinary thing is the language of that platform, which in effect made the point, in order to rebuild or have a great society, you had to have peace. Mm-hmm. That was the underlying context
right.
of
So they were saber rattling at the same time that they were
right.
talking peace. Well, what else have you learned, do you think, looking at platforms over time about history? Can you see a consistency about history in looking at political platforms?
Well, I think you can see a consistency of the problems that we face. One problem always which is present in one form or another is war and preparation for war and expansion that's really been there since the beginning of the United States, whether it was against the Indians, whether it was the Civil War, whether it was post-1898 and the Spanish-American War and so forth. There's always an addressing to the question of war because we are either in war or preparing for war. A second thing, which is always there in different forms, is the question of race. First, it's the question of slavery, then it's a question of race, neo-slavery. It then also begins to be transformed into the issue of poor versus rich, which we can talk about. That's always present. So the class then is part of that. Class issues are also always there in one form or another. For example, in the 1930s, that was a fundamental issue for the New Deal. Even, or I shouldn't say even, in the 1948 platform of Truman, this was a very important issue against Wall Street and so forth, which was picked up in order to co-opt the position taken by the Henry Wallace progressives. So that's always been there as well, as part of it. There's a fourth piece of this, which is national triumphalism. We are the greatest nation in the world. We are, there's nobody like us. We are the mansion on the hill and so forth and so on. And so there's always a form of patriotism. In some cases, it ends up into nationalist patriotism, almost a fascist type of thing. But mostly, it's just patriotism and pride in the United States. The pride also comes from another thing. It comes from the swearing of allegiance to the United States, because you'll recall that with the Civil War, it wasn't the case that at first 9 and 13 states were swearing allegiance to the United States. So patriotism then became defined in terms of that form of swearing allegiance.
It's not enough to just say you're the best party or you have the best candidate, but we have to be the best country
That's right.
in the world. Well, thanks for those historical insights. Let's turn now to the political platforms of this election year here in 2004. A lot of people on the political left complain a lot that the two parties, the two dominant parties, are identical, that there really aren't significant differences there. And, you know, looking at the platforms, I have to say a number of distinctions did jump out at me. And so I'd like to just identify a number of them. One is abortion rights. The Republicans say they want a constitutional ban on abortion. The Democrats say they proudly stand by a woman's right to choose. There's the gay rights issue. Republicans, again, want a constitutional ban on legal unions for same-sex couples. In the platform, they go even further to say they don't want gay partners to share in employee benefits. The Democrats, on the other hand, say they want full inclusion and benefits for gay and lesbian families. On trade policy, which is something that I work on a lot, I have to say I am actually kind of surprised to see that the Democrats did a pretty decent job of reflecting the concerns of labor unions, environmentalists, other groups that have very strongly opposed our current trade policies. The Republicans, on the other hand, are rah-rah for the status quo. I'd say on environment, the Democrats really come out as being much more advanced in their positions in supporting renewable energy and so forth. And just one other point on Social Security, the Republicans have said that they are in favor of at least partially privatizing Social Security, and the Democrats have said they are against that. And so just these are a few examples of where I see strong distinctions in the platforms. Is that enough for people to feel that American voters do have a choice in this election?
Well, again, I think the question is the hierarchy of interests of a particular voter. In other words, if you are gay, and you're for gay union, a gay marriage, you're definitely going to go to the Democrats. The position taken by the Republicans when they ask for constitutional amendments know very well that those, I would guess, cannot become constitutional amendments because they have to go through the states, they have to go through Congress, and there would be just too much fighting. So in a sense, this is eyewash as far as I'm concerned. Now, with regard to the environment, I think you're right. I think there is a profound difference. I would say that the purpose of the Democrats will be to undo some of the things that have been done over the course of the last few years. That, I think, is fairly clear in terms of who it is that they'll bring into those particular jobs. So I would say that where you're describing, there is a very big difference. There's a very big difference with regard to Social Security, where the interest is, and it's been a long-term one, of the Republican Party, really not to have a Social Security system, on the grounds that somehow a Social Security system would both protect people who probably shouldn't be protected, that is, the poor and the not so poor, and furthermore, that it is an invasion into the rights of the individual to invest his or her own money. The theory there being, again, that one generation should not take care of another generation. But it also misunderstands the way the Social Security system operates.
Well, speaking of the poor, I need to point out one similarity I noticed in both of the platforms, which is that I think they both pretty much ignore the poor. The Democratic platform has a big section on the great American middle class, and that is really their focus, with maybe a few exceptions, and the focus of the Republicans as well is on the middle class and not the poor. And I guess we can all be safe in assuming that a big part of the explanation for that is because the poor votes in, less percentage numbers than people in other income groups. And so they feel like they do not need to take that part of our population as seriously. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, if you think, has it always been that way? Have the dominant parties always pretty much ignored the interests of the poor?
The answer, I think, is no. There always has been, at least in the 20th century, interest in individual striving. So, for example, Woodrow Wilson talks about the striving of the individual to become part of the middle class, to, the big phrase, of course, has always been to be self-made. So that's been part of the lore of the American society, that we're self-made. Individuals are self-made, they don't have any help from anybody, and so forth and so on. The change, however, big time, comes again in the New Deal. And here, the argument is you can't have a nation which is one-third ill-housed, ill-clothed, poor, etc. And then by 1945, at the end of the Second World War, you have certain very interesting and important things happening. You have well over 16 million people who've been in the armed forces. They come back into American society, and the fear is they're going to come back. The fear of the government is they will come back into a society where there were 20% unemployed. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine having the return of so many millions of men and women who face unemployment. It would be a situation very similar to what happened in Germany after the First World War. So the position that was taken by President Roosevelt in his last address, in his last economic report to Congress, was a Bill of Rights for everybody. And that Bill of Rights started not from the position of the Bill of Rights for the middle class, the Bill of Economic Rights for the middle class, but a Bill of Economic Rights for everybody, in that context being the right to housing, the right to a job, the right to education, etc. Notice always these are rights. Mm-hmm. They're not necessarily something that you have in terms of entitlement.
Charity, not charity.
So just to finish the point, in terms of Clinton came forward and said, Bill of Economic Rights for the middle class. And again, this pushed down the concern of the poor and the lower middle class in ways that they're hidden.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Marcus Raskin. I have more questions for you, but I'll hold them to later and move now to Andy Levine. Again, Andy is a professor at the University of Wisconsin as well as an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland. And he's going to share his thoughts on the history and future of the Republican Party and the two-party system and where we're headed.
Well, I want to ask a question that might seem rather odd. I want to ask whether the GOP will survive until 2008. I think it's a fair question to ask. What is sure is that a struggle is underway in which the party itself is at stake, and that in that context, the Republican old guard, the prosperous and upper middle classes, are losing ground. It's precisely that old guard, along with so-called moderates who think as they do, that the Democrats want to win over. Indeed, for many in the Democratic Party, as evidenced in their platform and in their electoral politicking since their convention, it seems that their allegiance is even more desired than victory itself. Republicans and Democrats need one another. For the Democrats, the need is so acute that if the Republican Party did not exist, it would be necessary for them to invent it. The party of the lesser evil requires the specter of a greater evil still. In our electoral duopoly, only Republicans can play that role for Democrats. Indeed, if there is any other reason to be for the Democrats in 2004, it is subtle or well hidden. This is why John Kerry is the perfect standard bearer for the Democrats, for the Democratic Party today. His selection was warranted by one thing only, that among the relevant alternatives, he seemed to the majority of Democratic voters the most likely to keep Bush at bay. The Democratic Party has always drawn votes from an improbable mix of constituencies. Even before Bill Clinton moved the party several orders of magnitude to the right, it was lesser evilism that held it together, leading genuine liberals and trade unionists to find common ground with segregationists and social conservatives. Back then, when there really was a Democratic wing of the Democratic Party that wasn't thoroughly marginalized, the Republicans presented a more coherent picture. Theirs was the party of big business, but it was also the party of mainstream Protestant America. The robber barons and the farmers of the Midwest had at least that much in common. Shared material interests were scant, but cultural affinities joined Republican voters together. That world is gone, and its absence has registered in our political life for at least the past quarter century. The so-called Reagan Revolution marked its consummation. It was in that period that the grand old party came to rely for votes on radical evangelicals, hyper-Zionists, socially conservative Catholics, libertarians and like-minded proponents of voodoo economics, fiscal conservatives, neo-isolationists, and Teddy Roosevelt-style imperialists. In comparison, the Democrats seem almost homogeneous. Elements of the Republican old guard may be drawn to voodoo economics and at the extreme to libertarianism. And there are certainly fiscal conservatives, neo-isolationists, and imperialists among them. But however useful they may be, they have little in common with impoverished Protestant fundamentalists, conservative working-class Catholics, and uppity right-wing Jews. They have been extraordinarily adept, however, at manipulating the convictions of these constituencies and using them for their own benefit, a phenomenon brilliantly documented in Thomas Frank's new book, What's the Matter with Kansas? With the servile media in hand, they have proven right the dictum of the greatest Republican of all, that you can fool some of the people all of the time. However, as Lincoln also observed, there are limits to how much the people can be fooled because reality always intrudes. So far, though, reality has been kept at bay. How is that possible? The short answer is that the GOP stumbled upon the method the Democrats pioneered. They found a greater evil. But for Republicans to make lesser evilism work for them, they had first to set American politics on a new course. They had to change the conversation. The Democrats were more than willing to oblige. In an electoral duopoly, there can only be two lesser evil parties if there's some dimension along which parties cluster in a polarized way. This would be the case whenever parties can be arrayed along the left-right spectrum. Then those on the left would see the rightmost alternative as the greatest evil and vice versa. Until quite recently, such a spectrum did exist more or less within our two parties as much as between them. In brief, the left was egalitarian, the right was not. Since those who stand to gain from egalitarian redistribution outnumber those who stand to lose, and since our two parties actively conspire to marginalize independent and third-party candidacies, And since the Republican Party no longer has a liberal wing, just an increasingly anxious old guard and some fellow traveling moderates, there is no way for it to induce a majority or even a plurality of voters to vote for it on the basis of material interests. Therefore, so long as distribution is the issue, the Democratic Party can play the role of greater evil only for a small minority of very well-off voters. Fortunately for the Republicans, though, some influential Democrats got it into their heads around the time that Reagan and Bush assumed office that the way forward for them was to abandon, or rather to marginalize, the party's Democratic wing in an effort to win over moderates and old guard Republicans. This was not completely unreasonable. Where else could traditional Democratic constituencies go? Moreover, the way to implement this strategy was easy and obvious. All the Democrats had to do was remain liberal on the so-called wedge issues, the ones the Republicans were already using to entice legions of have-nots into voting against their own interests. Thus, a new left-right spectrum came into being, based more on what pundits call values than interests. This has become the terrain on which our elections today are fought. It goes without saying that this change of focus works to the advantage of the beneficiaries of the system in place because it takes redistribution off the table. The problem that the fortunate few now face is to secure what they have achieved by keeping the conversation stalled where it is. In this endeavor, the Democrats are on board. Should anyone from that party's now insignificant Democratic wing suggest otherwise, John Kerry recently took pains to remind the voting public that he is not a redistributionist. In deciding to become the party of well-off voters who cannot stomach fundamentalists, the Democrats, or rather the New Democrats as they started calling themselves in the 1980s, didn't just help Republicans change the conversation, they handed them a foil for every reactionary sentiment that had accumulated since the New Deal. The old Democratic coalition, minus the solid South, but with a bit of already disaffected moderate support in recompense, was still sufficiently robust to elect Bill Clinton president twice in the 1990s. But for a variety of reasons, not least his manifest inauthenticity and opportunism, Clinton was a leader who was easy to despise. It required no vast right-wing conspiracy to turn him into a target of cultural resentment, though it didn't hurt that there was a well-funded one operating in the wings, fanning the flames. Thus there came to be, if not exactly a greater evil, then its functional equivalent. Hatred of the Clintons and of what they came to represent to voters alienated by changes in 20th century mores sufficed to cement the Republicans' new unholy alliance. Nowadays, of course, Clinton is history. In 2000, Al Gore was still tarnished by the association, much as he tried not to be. But John Kerry is no Bill Clinton. To turn him into a target of resentment, the vast right-wing conspiracy will have to work overtime. It seems it has already begun. Still, one can only wonder how defenders of George W. Bush and the chicken hawks his selection empowered can accuse anyone, much less Kerry, of fabricating credentials for being a war president. Is that much chutzpah possible? Evidently so, at least for now. But mass delusions correct themselves eventually. The Republican Party is just fractious enough that maybe this time the correction will come before it is too late. For one thing, win or lose in November, conjunctural factors weigh heavily against the Republican Party. No one ever expected much from George W. Bush, but his father's cronies and protégés were a different matter. However, once in power, to everyone's amazement, they have governed with unsurpassed ineptitude. Despite the taint of illegitimacy that afflicted the Bush administration in its first half year, it was, after all, installed by Bush family cronies, they pushed forward with their own redistributionist agenda, redistributing from the poor to the rich. Then, shamelessly exploiting the opportunities handed them by 9/11, they plunged recklessly ahead, targeting not just the vestiges of the New Deal, but progressive era reforms too. By almost any measure, in almost every way, they have proven themselves utterly incapable. They've wreaked havoc on our economy despite an upturn in the business cycle. They've involved the country in two disastrous, never-ending wars. They've struck profound, if not fatal, blows at alliances that had endured for generations. They've undermined civil liberties. They've put the country at risk of terrorist attacks now and in the future to a degree that was unthinkable before. And although the Democrats are too cowardly to make an issue of it, they've committed the highest of crimes and misdemeanors. They lied the country into war. It's hard to imagine how any self-interested member of our economic elite could keep faith with these bunglers, especially when there is at hand a competent rival eager to step in and do them service. Many of them are no doubt moved by greed. They know from experience that there is almost nothing the Bush administration won't do for them. But how can they be so myopic? Can't they see that they really do need a state that functions as their executive committee, that forces them to forbear from seeking immediate advantages in order to keep the system afloat? Some do. This is why many among them are defecting. One can only feel embarrassed for the rest. The Democrats are plainly counting on the enlightened self-interest of the very, very rich to overcome that congenital loyalty to the Republican Party that keeps them in the Bush camp. It could happen. Despite its best efforts to the contrary, the Bush administration is pushing them away. There's a psychological dimension, too, in the new Democrat strategy. Some malefactors of great wealth, like Bush himself, are smugly indifferent to what anyone outside a narrow circle of like-minded people think. But the vast majority of moderate voters are of a different cast of mind. The Kerry campaign knows this. It was a theme of their Boston convention. They know that minus a few arrogant fools, our elites and those who think like them are as insecure culturally as were their counterparts in the Gilded Age, and therefore that there are many among them who in their hearts are uncomfortable with a commander-in-chief whom the whole world knows to be a laughingstock. This sensibility could become a factor with which to reckon. Beneficiaries of Republican policies have deeper structural reasons, too, to be anxious about the course their party is taking. Even if cultural resentments hold today's Republican voting bloc together, the Republican electorate has as much reason to resent other Republican voters as anyone else. Can support for the Israeli right keep Christian Zionists who seek to hasten the conversion of the Jews in Armageddon in the same camp as neocon Likudniks who can barely conceal their contempt? Will opposition to abortion and open homosexuality keep Protestant evangelicals forever aligned with Catholic social conservatives, followers of the Antichrist? And what of the poor libertarians? In this age of Ashcroft, and with social conservatism riding high, they've become as marginalized within the Republican Party as progressives are in the party of the lesser evil. It's no surprise, therefore, that the Libertarian Party is poised in 2004 to draw more than a few votes away from George W. Bush. To be sure, the Libertarians agree with other constituencies in the Republican electorate that taxes should be cut and social services restricted. For them, unlike the others, this is even a principled conviction. But since it is only the well-to-do who stand to benefit from such policies, one can only wonder how long unity can endure on this basis. Inveterate snobbishness matters too. It is why I, and evidently also the Kerry campaign, think defections are more likely at the top, at least in the short run, than at the bottom. The class composition of the Republican electorate is shifting. It may already have tipped to the point that the lower orders now run the show. If Kerry is the emblematic Democrat, George W. Bush epitomizes this transitional state of affairs. Descended on both sides from families that insinuated themselves into the highest reaches of the Eastern aristocracy, a graduate of Andover and Yale, he sounds, acts, and thinks like a nouveau riche Texas oil man, caricaturing with every gesture and remark the mores of the good people his family and their ilk have bled dry for generations. He comes on as a good old boy. But this is a pose that isn't easily reproducible in a politician capable of playing a national role, as Bush is by an accident of birth. Even Brother Jeb doesn't quite cut it. Before long, without a suitable figure whose personality somehow holds it all together, the Republicans will have to go one way or the other. The old guard and the moderates already know which way it will be. The Republican Party today reflects and magnifies the polarization of America's class structure. Everywhere, thanks largely to Republican policies and Democratic acquiescence, the very rich get richer at the expense of everyone else. Because they understand how their privileges are sustained, the old guard and the so-called moderates are content for now with this arrangement, but they can't like it much. This is why it is likely that at some point, maybe sooner than we think, they'll have had enough. If Bush doesn't embarrass them sufficiently to push them into the welcoming Democratic fold, his supporters will. Bill Clinton, the new Democrat, felt the pain of those on whom he inflicted it. But in the end, he'd rather hang out with the rich and famous, or failing that, with ordinary people blessed by fortune. So too would the rest of them. Why else would they assume the mantle of the Republican Party of yesteryear? Before they get their way, though, they have a lot of electoral inertia to overcome. But as the Bush administration wrecks everything it touches, and as it encourages the rabble to take control, the counterforce may prove irresistible. The present GOP leadership wants very much to resist this eventuality. They're aware, too, that the old guard is not yet ready, as Southern segregationists were 3 decades ago, to change party affiliations. They're intent on taking advantage of this resistance to change. Hence a platform that, taken at its word, is, in most respects, no more reactionary and, if anything, a tad less pious than the Democrats. Unlike the Democratic platform, which was controlled by the Kerry campaign and which therefore provides a good indication of what the Democrats in power will do, the Republican platform provides hardly any indication at all. The role of the platform instead is to remind the old guard that the party is not just for them, it is also still of them. Thus, the platform is paraded out in the same spirit as are people of color at their conventions, or moderates such as Giuliani, McCain, and Arnold Schwarzenegger. The idea is to reassure the voters, the Democrats, those voters that the Democrats want to win over, that the Republican Party still belongs to them, and that it is still moderate at its core. The problem of the GOP is that these PR gestures fly too much in the face of reality. From a strictly electoral point of view, it would make more sense for Democrats to go after the electorate that doesn't vote at all, the half of the electorate that doesn't vote at all, than to try to win over prosperous but anxious Republicans and moderate independents. And insofar as the Republican electorate is up for grabs, it would make more sense to go after the part of it that embarrasses the old guard than to go after the old guard itself. But the Democrats are loath to do anything of the sort because it would alienate their corporate paymasters. So what, one might ask, if the idea is only to raise money to get elected? But that isn't the only idea, at least not for the Democrats. There isn't enough percentage in it. There are perks that go along with being a party of the privileged, perks that go beyond the spoils of electoral office itself. Small wonder, then, that Democrats, especially new Democrats, look at the respectable remnant of the Republican Party, increasingly alienated from its base, and at the prosperous moderates who usually vote with them, and ask, why not us? With the Republican Party embodying so many contradictions, it is not an unreasonable question. The demise of the Republican Party, or if not that, its significant reconfiguration, would be a mixed blessing. But it does present an opportunity of a kind that has not existed for decades. It is the conventional wisdom that the coming election will be close. I confess I can't see how even the combined forces of James Baker, Karl Rove, and Osama bin Laden can save George Bush now. But even if Kerry only wins by a hair, the restoration of the lesser evil party will come as a relief for the world and for most Americans too. It will delay and perhaps even avert impending catastrophes brought on or accelerated by the short-sightedness and ineptitude of the current administration. Win or lose, though, the time is now to start to seize the opportunities that impending changes in party alignments will bring. Who knows, but perhaps soon we will be able to move beyond lesser evilism altogether and beyond the institutional arrangements, electoral and otherwise, that make it our best hope. Perhaps we can build a party that is genuinely, not just nominally, Republican and Democratic, a party of the vast disenfranchised majority.
Thank you, Andy Levine, for that very creative, if not depressing, description of our current political system. One question I want to throw out to Mark Raskin, and he can maybe address this in his comments as well as to the audience, is how do we move beyond lesser evilism? You know, can we hope that there will be real change in our political system here? Someone pointed out the other day or argued that really the only time in our history in this country we've had a third party rise to power was the Republican Party as a result of the ruptures during the Civil War, and argued that it takes that level of social upheaval in this country for anything like that to ever happen, so we can pretty much forget about it for the near future. On the other hand, you look at countries that have changed their political system. I've read a little bit about, New Zealand. They switched from having a British-style election system to a proportional representation one. It can be done in other countries. Is it possible here, and how could we do it? Mark Raskin, would you like to respond first, and then we'll take a few questions from the audience?
Well, I think, first of all, obviously it's very hard. Secondly, you do have to look for a systemic break in the organizing of a structure so that enough people leave that structure and say, we're going to move in another way. And that those people usually have to come from different classes together. And that's kind of the history of what happened in Europe. It's not necessarily the history of what happened in the United States in the agrarian period. In the 20th century, the systemic break came at the, in my view, at the Vietnam War period, in which it was clear that we were engaged in an impossible war, and it made no sense, and people understood that there were a lot of nuclear weapons around, and they could all go off, and somehow the system itself was not speaking to that question. And that at that time, you had what Andy's talking about. You had a Democratic Party which was made up of city bosses in the major cities, Southern racists, intellectual and labor bosses, and they could hardly hold themselves together. And labor during that period favored the war. And had labor not favored the war, that would have resulted in a very great change in American life. Indeed, wherever it was the case in the 20th century, for the labor unions to in fact come forward and support a third party, they didn't. And the fact that they did not have, that the parties did not, the small parties did not have the support of labor unions greatly narrowed the possibility for any change. One of the things, listening to Professor Levine speak, which is, I think, very important to remember, and this is a mild demur, is that the parties themselves now are quite protean. That is to say, they can take whatever shape anybody wants them to take as a result of a communication system which keeps hammering, a propaganda system which keeps hammering at the most simple-minded ideas and slogans, and people just keep at them and at them who are part of this propaganda machine. You saw this really in the 1930s in Germany and in the late 20s, where certain people understood that if you keep hammering at the same slogans and you make believe that somehow there are scapegoats or that there's a misunderstanding of who's really at fault and so forth, that then can enforce the anger of people to move very far over to extremes, but especially far over to the right. That's what happened in Germany. In this country, the question is tied to the fact that we have a war system and a national security system that we don't seem to be able to get out of. As you read the two-party platforms, each one attempts to outdo the other in terms of war-making possibilities and continuing continuing war as a basic way of life in America, and also as a basic economic system for the country, a defense system for it. The second is the fact that international capitalism is neither regulated by the national states, by the United States for, say, American corporations, or the United Nations. And that there are movements now in the world, of course, that want to confront this, but they're nowhere near as strong for that to occur. So one major issue in American life for a political party, and this struggle can go on either outside the political party, inside it, in demonstrations in small groups, is the need to address two fundamental ideas: the international corporation and its where it's going, and the national security state. There are other issues which can, in fact, be dealt with in the present system, in my view. One is a health system. Another is the protection of Social Security. A third is providing greater child care and so forth and so on. But the basic issues of this period are not being dealt with.
Well, we could open it up for questions from the audience if anyone would like to jump in. Right here. Can we bring the microphone up? Oh, go ahead, please.
Does it make intellectual or any kind of sense to you as far as the way the Reform Party has moved in the last decade, from Ross Perot to Jesse Ventura to Pat Buchanan to Ralph Nader? If you're talking about the trouble with the Democrats and Republicans, doesn't there seem to even be more problem with a Reform Party? I'm curious if you, and particularly now since Ralph Nader did get that Reform nomination, he didn't choose to seek the Green Party nomination. Was that a mistake? Would either of you have advice for him? And I'm wondering, do you think he may be too egotistical to lead a party?
You've hit on a pretty sensitive issue around here at the Institute for Policy Studies. Andy, would you like to?
Well, I don't want to give the impression that I was advocating third-partyism at this stage, although I suppose I do. I mean, I think that the main thing for us now, I think that the situation now, and this speaks to what Mark was saying before, is that opportunities are presenting themselves not because of any fundamental changes in our society, but because the Republican Party under George Bush has created so much havoc that that the Republican Party, which has been the main vehicle for securing the national security state and for enhancing the immiseration of the poor and the rest, it's done it with Democratic acquiescence, but it has been the main vehicle, that could very well go, or at least be so severely challenged that that things are going to change. Are the Democrats poised to take advantage of it? Hardly. Certainly not. They certainly don't seem to be, with their obsession with capturing the moderate voters in swing states. Is there a chance of reforming the Democratic Party from within, which was basically what Dennis Kucinich and Al Sharpton and maybe Carol Moseley Braun was trying to do? Again, I think that the prospects for that are bleak, as the situation there showed. Can it be changed from outside by someone like Ralph Nader? Well, Nader at least does, in a way, I think he's wrong about this in this electoral cycle, but at least in a way, by not pursuing a safe state strategy, he is, and if there is a fear on Kerry's part as the election draws closer that they could lose some states to the Nader vote, he is providing some kind of impetus for moving Kerry just a little bit more to the left than he would otherwise be. You know, but we're not. The problem is that we're just not that strong yet, and I think that what we need to do is to work out how to become stronger in the new period which is presenting itself, and in which, in a way, our greatest ally is George W. Bush. Win or lose, that's what's made openings possible.
Well, I think your question is a very important one. First of all, what is interesting now is a good number of the generals have turned against Bush. And that's a fascinating change in American politics, where they're prepared to speak out in a very direct way against what Bush has done. Part of it is because I think he's seen as an imprudent imperialist. And on the other side of the coin, I think they see Kerry as a prudent man, a prudent imperialist, and they would see him as much more competent, rational, and so forth. They also feel strongly, that is the generals, that they're being undercut by very stupid leadership, arrogant leadership inside of the Department of Defense. When it comes to the point that you're making, There's a rule in American politics which I suspect may apply at this stage, but doesn't usually apply, which is that people running for office invariably end up on opposite sides of the fence of each other. And as the campaign goes on, both end up sounding exactly alike. And both seem to be exactly in the center, indeed, each taking from the other what they're thinking about. That allowed for example, Nader, who I hold in the highest regard, to see platforms and political parties merely as tools or way stations, and no more, no less. I view that as a mistake. I see that again as a mistake that goes to the heart of how you can present a principled position beyond yourself, which is also manifested through a political party. The difficulty, I think, with Nader's position is that he is assuming that what he can do is catalyze a kind of change in the system as an individual that he was able to do with regard to confrontation with General Motors, but that's not happening.
Yeah, I was just hoping that you could comment a little bit about the history of protest at the conventions, as we've seen large amounts of folks demonstrating both up in Boston and in New York.
Well, there are different levels of protests that have occurred. In the 1930s, there were huge protests related to unemployment. There was something called the unemployment consuls, and there were some million people who were part of the unemployment consuls, and they did a very great deal of protesting both at elections and on the streets and so forth. The fact was that during that period, protests, and in American history generally, but during that period especially, they were quite violent. In other words, in some cases they would take over state capitals and they would sit there. This had occurred in Minnesota, for example, in North Dakota. In terms of the demonstrations in recent years, the demonstration, of course, at the Democratic Party convention turned out to be quite brutal. I know something about it because I attempted to start a party then called...
What year are you referring to?
1968, called the New Party. But the people on the streets at that point really would have none of that. And they were interested in getting arrested, confronting the Democratic Party. On the other side of the coin, Mayor Daley was very much into getting even with the people who were demonstrating. And he was trying to prove that indeed he could control that city. And he was less interested in what would happen to the Democratic Party and to Hubert Humphrey than he was to make clear that he could control the city.
Why don't we take one more question?
Hi, thank you. I was wondering, I guess I might be able to guess Andy's answer from what he was talking about earlier, but do you see a change in the two-party system in the United States? And if so, would that happen suddenly with the demise of one of the major parties, or would it happen slowly with implementations of policies like instant runoff voting and other policies that allow third parties to compete on a national level?
Well, that's a question that should be addressed to a younger person, not to me. In other words, I look back and look at the present. I can only speculate and hope about what should happen. Obviously, some things come, as I've suggested, from major events. For example, if it's the case that a nuclear weapon goes off someplace in the world, or the United States begins using nuclear weapons, that will cause a major shift inside American life. If it's the case that a crisis occurs in the economic system that both simultaneously goes to inflation and depression, that causes a profound institutional decomposition. If you're asking me the question, can things move slowly that way? I'm not so sure, because I am struck by the fact that the situation in this country is open to mass manipulation. Indeed, we've learned over the last few years that a lot of a lot of votes don't get counted. And the reality of the matter is that unless there's constitutional change, the Electoral College makes clear that this is not a democracy, this is at best a republic. So there has to be major shifts, in my view, in the structure itself, beyond the parties.
Thank you, Marcus Raskin, and thank you also, Andy Levine, for being our guest today. I also want to thank people who've tuned into this program. And for those of you who don't know very much about the Institute for Policy Studies, I want to share that we are an organization that for over 40 years has been linking scholarship with activism. We do research, we do education that's linked to social movements, starting with the civil rights movement in the 60s, the women's movement, and these days with the peace and global justice movement. I want to highlight just in 1 second part of our work that we're very proud of, and that is that for nearly 30 years we have been struggling to bring justice for the victims of Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet. It's been a long struggle. We got involved because 2 of our colleagues were assassinated by agents of Pinochet right here in Washington, D.C. in 1976 by a car bomb. We've been working with people around the world to hold Pinochet accountable for these crimes. And we are celebrating today because the Chilean Supreme Court has stripped Pinochet of his immunity from prosecution, and he now appears to be headed to trial. And I want to congratulate my colleague, Marcus Raskin, who has been central to this struggle for so many years. I also want to, and I sincerely mean that he has been on the front lines of those battles. If people want more information about the Institute for Policy Studies, you can go to our website. Let me give out the web address. It's www.ips-dc.org. That's ips-dc.org. We have a great study on that website about the costs of war. We've documented the costs for Americans, Iraqis, and people around the world. Next week, we'll have a great new study out about CEO pay at companies that are leading the trend of outsourcing service jobs to low-wage countries. And there's lots of other great information on there. I'll give the website one more time. It's ips-dc.org. And thank you once again, our panelists, Marcus Raskin and Andy Levine, as well as our audience here in Washington, our listeners on Pacifica Radio, and our viewers on C-SPAN. Thanks again. I'm Sarah Anderson.
What you're saying about the Republicans is making sense, but do you believe the same problem exists with the Democrats? That wasn't why. Just as far as those groups that are deliberately trying to be peaceful or quiet, but win or lose, they're going to not remain that way for long. Like I was fighting over reparations you see that? I'm sure they stay democratic. Good job. I'm sure.